Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome.
Great to be here again once more with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I thought we'd discuss, Richard, an issue that really is no part of the discussion on the presidential political scene. We can discuss the reasons why, but that issue is the Federal Reserve. You know, when Ron Paul was running, there was this mantra that became very popular called "End the Fed." And it was a phenomenal thing. I mean, who would have ever thought that the Federal Reserve would become a major issue in a presidential race? But Ron Paul made it an issue. And it was interesting because you had people from the right and the left and, of course, libertarians talking about end the Fed, dismantle the Fed. So we don't see any of that discussion in this presidential race. I certainly don't recall any of I haven't watched the debate scrupulously, but I haven't ever heard of any of the debate moderators asking whether the candidates favor the abolition of the Federal Reserve. But certainly from a libertarian perspective, it ought to be discussed because the Federal Reserve is one of the most destructive agencies that we have in our society, as far as I'm concerned. To me, it's just as destructive as the Internal Revenue Service and the income tax, because this is the engine of inflation. This is the engine of monetary debasement. This is what enables the politicians and the bureaucrats to continue spending much more than they bring in taxes. They add to the mountain of debt, but they're never concerned about the debt because they're counting on the Federal Reserve to monetize the debt through debasement of the monetary supply. And then as the inflation of that money supply gets going, people start blaming it on rapacious businessmen and people for raising their prices, when it really is the government, the Federal Reserve, that's plundering and looting people by simply debasing and devaluing their money. So, you know, here is this engine of booms and busts and bubbles and bursting bubbles and recessions and depressions, and hardly a mention of it in the presidential race. But it should be mentioned, Richard, and it should be abolished. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I think it's useful perhaps to review a little bit of the history and the theory of the circumstances under which the Fed came into existence and the practice that it has undertaken during the last 100 years that it has been in existence. In the 19th century, there was a hodgepodge of different types of banks in the U.S. Banks were established at a state level. They were licensed or approved or chartered, as the phrase goes, at a state level. There was very little interstate banking. The U.S. government had attempted to play with establishing a form of a central bank in the early decades of the 19th century, the 1800s, with the first and second National Bank of the United States. This was set up as a bank by the U.S. government, and there were two of them. Both of them, to make a very interesting but long story short, ended up in financial disaster. It was finally brought to an end in the 1830s when then President Andrew Jackson refused to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. There was an unbelievable amount of misuse and abuse of power. If I remember correctly, the governor of the Maryland branch of the Second Bank of the United States suddenly disappeared with well over $1 million of the bank's assets and went to Europe. Now, $1 million in the 1830s must represent, like, calculated, what's a dollar of that time worth today. It must be several tens of millions of dollars, if not more. But he absconded basically with this. He was never heard from again. Then after that, there were just basically, as I said, these state chartered banks. This was called the free banking era. It really wasn't a free banking era because of the heavy-handed involvement of government in chartering, regulating, restricting branches across state lines in the vast majority of cases. If banks went into trouble, they would go to the state legislature to be bailed out in various and sundry ways. And then during the American Civil War, that is from 1861 to 1865, Lincoln's administration decided that they needed basically a printing press to fund the war. So they set up the national banking system. And this chartered national banking system could make loans to both the private sector and to the government, but it needed capital to be the financial basis of the institution. And it basically was said, well, we're going to set this bank up, we're going to charter it, but its assets, that is its capital base, has to be government debt. So for the bank to come into existence, it had to agree to take this government debt and then to create paper money on the basis of this debt that Lincoln's Union government could spend. This was the origin of the greenbacks, for instance. It was green money, and on one side was a male deer, a buck, and with the horns, and that's why they were also called bucks. $2, $3. The U.S. was taken off the gold standard during the war by the North. America's worst inflation for the entire 19th century occurred during that time. Consumer prices, wholesale prices. The government attempted to abolish gold contracts so as to force people to accept its paper money. And then finally, that was ended. That degree of price inflation was ended with the end of the Civil War, and the government got its financial house in order. But there was still this existing national banking system that required government debt as its basic capital asset foundation. And the problem in the years after the Civil War, as the debt was being paid off, I know it's a hard thing to believe, Jacob, but a government paying off its debt. But as the government was doing that, it was obviously taking a debt out of circulation, including in the hands of this bank, which limited the bank's ability as just a banking entity to have the adaptability and the flexibility to handle changing market circumstances for just the customers. So there were a number of banking crises. There was concerns about the flexibility of this banking system, which was a growing economy. So rather than ask the question, well, why have government involved in the banking business at all, even in this chartering element and making government debt some essential capital asset on the basis of which they're restricted in making loans? Why not just set up private competitive banking by just getting government out of the way? There was a functioning gold standard, and so just use gold as a private asset for banks to hold as reserves, guided by profit and loss opportunities in competition with each other. But instead, there emerged this movement in the late 19th and especially in the first decade of the 20th century that because of what we're seeing as financial rigidities and instabilities in the economy, there had to be a solution, not in the area of banking free enterprise, but to follow the European model of a central bank. And the upshot of it was, without talking about all the special interests involved and the characters of sometimes called conspirators, just the narrow sense, the decision was made and agreed to for the establishment of the Federal Reserve. It was chartered in 1913, and it opened its doors in January of 1914. So it's a little over 100 years old. Now, at the time, Jacob, the charter of the Federal Reserve was very simple. It was to manage the money supply of the country, which at that time was a gold standard, to assure financial and economic stability, basically to prevent inflation. And then over time, that charter was expanding, oversight of banks who were members of the Federal Reserve, but its primary duty was to maintain the stability and value of the currency. Immediately is a little exaggeration, but shortly after its founding, it became an engine of paper money inflation. Why? Well, World War I began in Europe in August of 1914, and America entered the war on the Allied side, the British and French and the Russian side, in April of 1917. Well, just like the European participants had the need for some means to finance their war efforts since the war began 2.5 years earlier. The U.S. government now needed the financial means to participate in this war on the Allied side. Part of it was raising taxes, but the fact is that a huge proportion, if I remember correctly, something like 40 or over 40% of all the funding to cover the U.S. government's war expenditures during the year and a half of the First World War that we were participating in that conflict, at least 40% was covered by the Federal Reserve basically just creating paper money. And that caused a huge price inflation in the United States, again by historical standards, following then a recession, a post-war recession in 1920 and early 21. Now, this was a relatively mild recession because back then, again, hard to believe, the government minded its own business. It allowed the market to adjust to the post-war boom, new market supply and demand conditions. Prices fell, output declined, unemployment rose significantly, but it's what economists call a V-shaped recession, a steep decline but a rapid recovery, because basically markets were left alone to accommodate, adjust, and rebalance themselves. But then the problem is that in the early to the end of the 1920s, from I'd say 1922 to the dawn of 1929, the Federal Reserve decided to again micromanage the economy, not to create a war-related inflation, but supposedly to stabilize prices, neither inflation nor deflation. But this again set an unstable situation because in a growing economy, as the 1920s were, it would have been naturally a case that prices would have gently fallen as technology and production was resulting in more goods offered on the market at lower cost of production. But to counteract what would have been a market-induced and healthy natural price deflation, the Federal Reserve took most of the 1920s to pump money in to prevent prices from falling to the degree that markets would have gently set them. So prices were artificially kept higher under the illusion of a stable price level, which, particularly as the Austrian economists emphasized, set the stage for the Great Depression, where the House of Cards collapsed in 1930. Then the Federal Reserve exacerbated it with wrong-headed and misguided monetary policies in the early 1930s, which made the contraction of the economy probably even worse than it had to be. And then when the economy was even moderately recovering in the middle of the 1930s, though not a real recovery, the economy fell into another recession in 1938 because, again, of monetary mismanagement by the Fed. Then during the war of the Second World War, the government basically financed, the Federal Reserve basically financed a huge amount of the government expenditures, funding its deficit spending for this. But it was hidden from view in terms of its full inflation effect because of price and wage controls. Throughout the post-war period in the 1950s, the economy went through sort of moderate recessions, about 3 recessions, if I recall correctly, in the 1950s. And then again with the 1960s, with the Johnson administration, on the one hand, domestically initiating the Great Society programs, yet at the same time needing the financing for a war in Vietnam, and not willing to give up one or the other, given the budgetary constraints. They decided both guns and butter, and by the historical times of that period, the Johnson administration ran significant budget deficits, all funded by the Federal Reserve to cover the cost of both the domestic growing welfare state and the war in Vietnam, which grew to a massive inflation, again by historical standards, in the late 1970s and early 80s, when price inflation was in the average of about 15% for a period of time at an annual rate, which by American historical standards was the highest since the Civil War. And then a necessary adjustment in the early 1980s during the Reagan administration, which brought about a stable monetary environment for the economy to have a rather successful growing period through most of the 1980s and into the 1990s. And then just to continue briefly the thumbnail history of what the Fed was doing, then viewers will recall that in the second half of the 1990s was really the acceleration of what was called the high-tech boom, the high-tech bubble, the internet and computer, cell phone industry. And the Fed, again, was undertaking a huge, massive monetary expansion to help foster that bubble. And then that had a downturn in the beginning of this century, partly because of the scare with 9/11. But then in around 2002 and 2003, the Fed leadership, in this case Alan Greenspan and then his heir apparent Ben Bernanke, beginning in 2002 and 2003, said the new fear in America is deflation, price deflation. And they set the U.S. economy beginning in 2003 on a huge increase in the money supply. Between 2003 and 2008, the money supply, broadly defined, increased by about 50%. That's what created the housing bubble, the investment bubble, the consumer debt bubble that all crashed in 2008, 2009. And then first Bernanke and now Janet Yellen, rather than allowing markets to correct, to admit that monetary mismanagement had set the stage for these unsustainable market situations, have increased the money supply again in the banking system by $4 trillion, so that we've seen a moderate recovery. But all of this basically has brought about, in my humble opinion, degrees of imbalances and distortions among different sectors of the economy, given wrong signals to people on how to use their income and invest their resources, that I believe will eventually set us up for another recession that's going to be hit us at some point. The bottom line in just giving this thumbnail history of the Fed, however briefly and superficially, they were set up supposedly for macroeconomic or monetary stability, maintain the value of the currency to help maintain growth with a high degree of economic stability, that is, now minimizing the booms and busts of the business cycle. Instead, what we've experienced is some of the worst inflations in U.S. history, the most catastrophic depression in U.S. history, and now a series of significant financial bubbles that have burst in this new century, all under the micromanagement of a Federal Reserve that continues to arrogantly and pretentiously believe that they have the knowledge, wisdom, and ability to manage the economic system of the country when they do not. You will recall that the Future Freedom Foundation, you've heard of that organization, Jacob.
I have. It's yes, supposed to be a good organization.
Last year, if you can remember that far back, published this ebook by this weird economist called Monetary Central Planning in the State, in which this weird economist tried to explain not just this little bit of a history, but to explain why logically, inherently, central banking is a form of central planning, in which a group of central planners are given the power, authority, and the directing order to try to manage the value of the money, the business climate, the banking system, have the authority to manipulate interest rates, the price that's supposed to bring savings and investment into balance. And it is not surprising that we've seen this disastrous century of the Federal Reserve as our form of monetary central planning, when inevitably any form of planning, including monetary planning, will inevitably bring about imbalances, distortions, mismatching of supplies and demands, misuse of resources, and exacerbating whatever instabilities might have naturally occurred to make them far worse than would have occurred if the Federal Reserve had never existed.
Yeah, Friedrich Hayek wrote that great book, The Fatal Conceit, where he talks about the conceit of the planner. And the Austrian school, which libertarians subscribe to, of economics, is an indictment of central planning. It says that, look, whenever a group of people in a board or commission or legislature or whatever tries to plan peaceful activities, you're going to have what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. And I don't think you could have a better example of this than the Federal Reserve. I mean, here you have this board planning the monetary activities of millions upon millions of people. How would you expect anything other than to have chaos and crises on a constant basis? And when you look back at U.S. history, Richard, we had the greatest monetary system in history. Not a perfect system. As you point out, there was a lot of imperfections in the banking industry with rules and regulations and so forth. But here the framers brought into existence a gold and silver coin standard, where gold coins and silver coins were the official medium of exchange under the Constitution, and that any bills and notes that the government issued were evidence of indebtedness. But it was clear from the Constitution that the states were prohibited from making paper money, official legal tender. That was what was called bills of credit, paper money. The states were prohibited by the Constitution from issuing them. And the Constitution also said the states shall not make anything but gold and silver coins legal tender. And then there was no authority granted to the federal government to make paper money, bills and notes legal tender. So here you had this monetary system where the official money was gold and silver coins. And that, in my opinion, was one of the main reasons for the tremendous prosperity from 1800 to 1900. That the greatest rise in standard of living, I think, in world history, because you had not only the fact that people were keeping everything they earned because there was no income tax or IRS, but they also had the confidence that they could invest in long-term capital projects and that it wasn't going to be inflated out of existence by the Fed. I mean, you had corporations, railroads issuing 100-year bonds, and people were investing them with confidence because they had to be paid in the gold value at that time. So they didn't have to worry about any kind of debasement of the currency over the next 100 years or so. And it was only when the Fed came into existence and started inflating its debt, debasing the amount of money, amount of paper indebtedness, that suddenly the government realized we can't honor all of these bills and notes with gold and silver coins. That's when they go off the gold standard. That's when they decree, well, now we're going to use these paper evidence of indebtedness as real money. And then they nationalize gold. And all of this is rooted in the monetary mismanagement. But even then, Richard, if you think back to the 50s and 60s, there were still silver coins circulating, silver dollars and quarters and half dollars, dimes, silver dimes. But gradually, it's what Gresham's law, that bad money will drive out the good money, that the Fed keeps inflating the money supply to accommodate this massive, ever-growing debt that comes about from spending on the welfare state, the warfare state. And finally, those silver coins go out of circulation as well. Now, they're still around. You can still get them. They call them junk silver, but you'd never use them. You'd never take a silver dime and go put it into a vending machine because you can get a lot more paper money with that silver dime in the marketplace. So you have this whole century of monetary chaos, of debasement, of plunder, of looting. And then, they always blame the inflation on the private sector. But it's really the Federal Reserve that is doing the inflating of the money supply. And so we end up with this system of really just monetary plunder, where the government has figured out a nice, sophisticated way to plunder and loot people by just printing more money up, and people don't realize what's happening.
You're absolutely right. Your point about that, it is not that long ago that silver coinage still circulated. I remember that when I first started teaching, and I wanted to make this point of specie-backed money as opposed to fiat money. There was that time when there was the transition occurring where you would still have basically a silver content quarter, and now this sort of copper quarter was sort of like a silver covering on it. And I would go into my class with the silver quarter and now this new like copper covered quarter. And I would just flip them and let them land on the desk. The silver quarter sounded solid. The copper quarter just had this tinny sound. And I would say to the class, which quarter would you like in your pocket and you would trust? Well, it was obvious, right? Even in that superficial, dramatic, silly way. But that was a symbolizing thing. This represented a commodity that way back when the market had chosen as a medium of exchange to facilitate the buying and selling of goods and services that private transactors found most useful and efficacious to proceed to gain from mutual gains from trade, versus this teeny coin that the government had substituted for this more real and market-based money as an indication and a symbol of its undermining and debasing of the currency and leaving us with something that had far less real market worth compared to what the market had chosen and would have continued to use if not for the intervention of the state in monetary affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the time we have left, let's discuss the ideal situation. I mean, what are libertarians fighting for? I mean, we're fighting to abolish the Fed, but in a larger sense, we're calling for a free market monetary system, and we believe in the free market.
Yes.
If there's anything that characterizes libertarians, we have this deep faith in the free market. The free market produces the best of everything in goods and services. And Hayek wrote that great essay called The Denationalization of Money, where he suggests taking things to a higher level. I mean, obviously the gold standard where gold coins and silver coins were the money, the official money of the United States was a much better system than what we've had for the last 100 years. But really the ideal, I think, Hayek presents in the denationalization of money, and that is a total separation of money in the state. That even though the U.S. government did a very good job in minting gold coins, the American Eagle, the silver dollar, and so forth, why not just let the free market decide what the best money is? And that just means people interacting. My hunch is they go to gold and silver coins, but here in this digital era, you don't know. They may come up with something even better, like a Bitcoin type thing. But if you get rid of the Fed and you turn over the medium of exchange concept just to the free interactions of people in the marketplace, then you end up with the best money because competition in the market process always produces the best of everything. So we separate money in the state, and then, of course, we get rid of the welfare state, which means a separation of charity in the state. We dismantle the national security state, get rid of all the foreign wars and the interventions and the terrorism that come with them. Well, now you're talking about abolishing the income tax because you don't need the money to fund the welfare warfare state, and then you got a free market monetary system. Now here we're talking about a real free and prosperous society, Richard.
Yes, the key issue is not so much whether to be for or against a gold standard. One can point to the history of gold as a market-chosen medium of exchange. One can talk about that period of more reliable and trusting and principled government that in the late 19th and early 20th century basically oversaw, admittedly a government-managed, but gold standard, in which gold maintained its value and served in that long-term investment environment, as you talked about a few minutes earlier. But what the advocate of liberty should be talking about is not being for or against gold as the monetary standard or for or against silver as the monetary standard, but monetary freedom. That is the policy prescription of the classical liberal or libertarian for the money side of the free society, monetary freedom. The participants in the marketplace should decide what individual or set of medium or media of exchange they find most useful, efficient, and effective to facilitate their transactions and commercial businesses and the buying and selling in the marketplace. Gold and silver might still have a place. Something like Bitcoin or some other variation on that theme might have its place. Other things might be used. It may end up that we have several. It might end up that at the end of the day, the market process will find that is through the interactions of people themselves, one or two within a large geographical area. But it should be the market that decides this and not the political authorities. And that applies to the banking system as well. It's not only that the market should be free to pick the medium of exchange, the money, but the market should have a market-based banking system, which banks act as repositories and guard people's chosen money. Any notes issued or checking account claims to them should be viewed as claims to a market-chosen real money, whatever it might be, that is being held on deposit for security and convenience, and not as something to manipulate through arbitrary expansion. And that the competition itself as the free banking advocates have long argued and I believe convincingly demonstrated, will assure that no bank will have it in its self-interest to take advantage of its depositors or its investment opportunities by artificially expanding its note claims to the medium of exchange on deposit, because there will be the concerns by depositors as the bank overreached and bank withdrawals, a panic, as well as other banks demanding payment when you have cross-trading and clearing houses of claims against the banks for their respective holdings of each other's currencies. All of this will act as natural checks and balances within the market to assure that you have a stable, effective, efficient, and competitive banking system that is operating with and through the medium or media of exchange that the market participants themselves have chosen as the money that enables them to go about their consumer and investment and business affairs in the most efficient and efficacious way to assure that people's lives and standards of living can be the greatest possible given their choices and savings decisions in a free society.
Yeah, and I look at choosing the bank as just choosing a stock to invest in. I mean, people invest in the stock market, and if their stock goes bad, the company goes bust, they have to bear the responsibility for that. They do their own research, and people tend to start getting careful when they realize that they may lose money in the stock market. Well, to me, the same thing applies to banks. You got to do your research. You decide which banks are safer, which ones are engaging in less fractional reserve banking, for example. And if you want to take the risk, you choose the riskier bank. You get a higher rate of return, but you take your chances. If your bank goes under, that's your responsibility. You should not expect other people to bail you out. Subject to insurance, you can buy insurance for such things. In the few minutes we have left, though, Richard, let's talk a little bit about books that people could look at. One of the people that played a big role for my intellectual development in this area of monetary freedom was Hans Sennholz. And I know you're familiar with Hans. He was chairman of the economics department at Grove City College. He later became president of FEE, where you were president of. I served as program director there. But he wrote some great stuff on monetary freedom. He had that great little book called Money and Freedom that just explained what you and I have just talked about so well. If anybody can get a hold of that book, if it's still in print, I highly recommend it. And then there's Mises's little booklet called What Has Government Done to Our Money? And
that's
then
Rothbard's book.
That was Rothbard's book.
Okay.
And Rothbard has done fantastic stuff on the Great Depression. So why don't you encapsulate some of the books that you think are important in this field?
Right. Well, of course, the masters in this are the Austrian economists. Though it's obviously more than just the issue of free banking, I would suggest to anyone who's interested in these matters to look at Ludwig von Mises's Theory of Money and Credit and that portion of his great treatise, Human Action, that focuses on money, credit, and the banking system. I would also highly recommend that he look at some of the other writers that have touched upon this, particularly two excellent economists who are connected with George Mason University, and that's Lawrence White and George Selgin. They really took Mises's ideas, and especially Hayek's ideas. You mentioned his denationalization of money, or his great little essay called Choice in Currency, which was the stimulus for him to then write the book on denationalization of money. And Lawrence H. White and George Selgin have taken this idea and developed and actually created an entire subfield of literature, some technical, but most of them very approachable and readable by the interested and informed person on free banking, competitive banking, ways that it could be established, the reasons why central banking is so inefficient and disastrous in comparison to them. I would also mention that there's another economist in England named Kevin Dowd, D-O-W-D. He has a number of other little books as well as bigger books on these free banking ideas and topics. And then if I can be self-serving here, Jacob, our book, Monetary Central Planning in the State, which the Future Freedom Foundation very kindly and generously published last October, and which for a long time was among the top 10 on the Amazon ebook list for its categories. In this book, I explained the Austrian economic point of view on money and banking in the business cycle, contrast it with the Keynesian approach and the monetarist approach of the Chicago School, and then the latter part of the book, about a third of the book, is devoted precisely and directly to the issue of central banking versus private competitive banking, the weaknesses and the contradictions and inescapable problems of central banking, and the nature, meaning, and how a free banking system could effectively operate and give people both a sound and stable monetary and financial system while also assuring people liberty and freedom in these affairs.
Yeah, that's a fantastic ebook, and it's called Monetary Central Planning of the State. The author is Richard Ebeling, and it's inexpensive price, $2.99, and it's fantastic, and it's selling great. I mean, it's really we're overly pleased with the sales of this thing. So if you haven't read it, we highly recommend it. It's a nice introduction to the concepts that we've been discussing today. Well, that's the show, Richard. Enjoyed it as always.
It was great to be here again with our viewers and listeners, and until next time.
Yep, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for tuning in.